Happy Earth Day, everyone. 50 years ago, Earth Day's founders were both enjoying and creating a tailwind for environmental progress. When the first Earth Day was celebrated, Congress had just enacted the National Environmental Policy Act, which is a foundational protection and safeguard for our public health and environment, and is seen in our work at CLF day in and day out. Most recently, it played a large role in defeating the effort to cut a swath of destruction through New Hampshire's White Mountain National Forest for a new power line. They also were creating a tailwind in the sense that there followed after that first Earth Day a series of broadly supported bipartisan efforts to protect the environment in the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, stronger protection for endangered species. And today, there's much to celebrate about what we've accomplished under those laws, but there's much to worry about. And there are new threats that those Earth Day founders could never have imagined. Obviously, they could not have imagined the pandemic and its impacts, and the fact that today, rather than gathering in public, we're coming to you in your homes from ours by teleconference. But more importantly, they could not have foreseen the types of threats and the efforts to actually undo some of their work that we're seeing day to day, even during this crisis. While the Earth Day founders could celebrate the National Environmental Policy Act and its new protections, the Trump administration marked that 50th anniversary of that law by actually proposing to undo it and to limit its reach significantly, limit its protection significantly. While this month many of our waters throughout New England are cleaner and healthier because of the Clean Water Act, the Trump administration just recently proposed to roll back the scope of that Clean Water Act, essentially using the regulatory process to limit and defang the law so that polluters will have freer reign and wetlands will be open season for filling. Under the Clean Air Act, a great deal of progress has been made under both Republican and Democratic administrations, particularly to remove toxins from our air that threaten our health as well as our environment. And just this month, the Trump administration not only proposed to eliminate protections that stop dirty power plants from emitting mercury and other toxics into the air, but also rolled back a long-term plan originally supported by the auto industry that would have given us all cleaner cars and cleaner communities. Those are threats I don't think the first Earth Day celebrants could have foreseen, and they're ones that require action to stop so that we can stay on the target that they foresaw, which is a cleaner and cleaner environment, a more sustainable and just society. There are also some things that we didn't get quite right in those early environmental laws, particularly the impacts of pollution on the poor and on communities of color. Those are the communities hit first and worst by toxins like mercury, by climate risk. And we still have a lot of work to do to bring those statutes into alignment with a more just society as well as a more sustainable world. We need your support in these efforts, and we're delighted that you've joined us this morning to learn a little bit more about them on this Earth Day and to answer our call to action to stop the undoing of our environmental and public health protections and move forward in our transition to a cleaner society that'll give our next generations a climate that's livable and something like the one that we've enjoyed here in New England during our lifetimes.
On the first Earth Day, 50 years ago, the United States was just beginning to understand that the pollution we were spewing into our air and water threatened our health and was killing our environment. Laws like the Clean Water and Clean Air Acts did not exist or were in their infancy. There was no environmental protection agency, and only a small group of scientists were warning about the so-called greenhouse effect, climate change as we know it today. CLF was founded just a few years before that first Earth Day. Back then, the idea of using the law, policy, and science to defend the public's right to a clean and healthy environment was novel and untested. In the 50 years since, our trailblazing work here in New England helped to shape the modern environmental movement and put teeth to our bedrock environmental laws.
I want to welcome everybody here tonight and thank you for coming out.
We blocked oil and gas drilling on Georgia's bank, cleaned up the dirtiest harbor in America, helped defeat a destructive dam on Maine's Penobscot River, launched first-of-their-kind lawsuits against ExxonMobil and Shell for their climate deceit, paved the way for the nation's first offshore wind farm, pushed successfully for the first marine national monument in the Atlantic, secured stronger protections for Lake Champlain in Vermont, shut down coal in New England, and blocked a polluting power plant in Rhode Island. Today we stand at a turning point. Climate change is the biggest crisis of our generation. We don't have another 50 years to fix the damage we have done and are doing to our climate and to our communities. The old models of protecting our environment and our communities no longer apply, so we are once again leading in creating new ones. We need you to sustain our fight. Together, we can create a New England where all people can breathe easy, drink clean water, and thrive in a just and clean economy.
Welcome back. My name is Carol Gregory, and I oversee communications at Conservation Law Foundation. And I'm here today just to moderate today's conversation. You've already met our president, Brad Campbell. Also joining us, Emily Green, our senior attorney, who's joining us from Maine. Hello, Emily.
Good morning.
And
Morning.
joining us from Rhode Island, staff attorney Kevin Boudris. Hello, Kevin.
Hi, good morning.
So we want this to be a conversation, and we really want to hear from you. So I'm just going to kick us off with a couple of questions, but I encourage you, as Tyler mentioned at the beginning, if you're joining us through the website, you can just join as a guest and get your chat and your questions in there through the chat feature. And if you're joining us through Facebook, just enter your questions into the comment line, and we'll be getting to those shortly. So I guess we should start off. I mean, this is a time that, as Brad mentioned, this is certainly not how we thought we'd be celebrating the 50th Earth Day. Many of us working remotely at home and dealing with this COVID-19 global pandemic. I'm wondering if there's any lessons that we can learn in how the response to COVID-19 and how the government has responded to COVID-19. What are some lessons we can learn in terms of how we are dealing? Are there lessons we can learn in how we're dealing with the climate crisis?
Yeah, thanks, Carol. I think that is an important question, and it would be a real shame not to take what we've learned from the pandemic and apply it in the future. There are principles that can be derived from our response, the successes and the failures, that can inform how we respond to the climate crisis. And one of the important things that has emerged is the critical role of state leadership. This is particularly pivotal in the face of an inadequate federal response. What we're seeing play out in front of our eyes is that the country's response to the coronavirus is actually largely playing out at the state level. And this is revealing the scale of potential achievement in the states. It's also demonstrating that state governments have a pivotal role to play, even in combating a global crisis. And these principles have application to the climate crisis as well. We at CLF have long recognized that state and regional climate action and preparedness can really move the needle. State level work is necessary not only to directly reduce climate damaging emissions from within each state, but also for what it can engender beyond that particular state's borders. So for instance, state leadership can advance broader outcomes by demonstrating what is possible, by serving as a model, by sending a signal not only to individuals, but also to businesses and manufacturers and markets, States can generate momentum through their action. And of course, state efforts are amplified when states work collectively. And we're seeing that even today as states coordinate with one another in their planning efforts with regard to the pandemic response. Applying those principles, a major push of CLF has been to secure passage of meaningful climate change laws in each of the New England states. And I think we'll talk about that some more later on in this hour.
Yeah, and
Thank you,
I
Emily.
think it's important to recognize that that has always been so. There's always been a base of state and local leadership that's propelled environmental protection. Uh, Even the first Clean Air Act was really based on state models that were out there. And here in New England, we've often been in the vanguard of new environmental protections. The Mercury rules that the Trump administration is now rolling back really reflected action on the part of states under their laws originally to reduce the amount of toxic mercury coming from power plants and being consumed by all of us in fish and other elements of the food chain. And so I think it's important to recognize that there's an interactive effect. Here in New England, we had the first climate law in the nation, one of the first enforceable requirements that there be reductions in greenhouse gases economy-wide. That's a law that we're in the process of enforcing at CLF now and demonstrating that the solutions we need, whether it's for the climate crisis or for healthier communities, are there if we have the political will and the public support to move forward with them.
I'm wondering if you could talk a bit, because one thing that we found alarming during these past several weeks has been some of the corporations that have come in and trying to use the pandemic, or it appears that way, to push or escalate environmental rollbacks. We've seen it with the plastic industry. We saw the fossil fuel industry come forward and try to take a grab on some stimulus funding. Can you speak to that?
Absolutely, Carol. This pandemic really has exposed some corporate bad actors who are exploiting this public health crisis to pad their own pockets. As you mentioned, fossil fuel companies are pursuing bailout money and pursuing stimulus funds that should be going to communities and workers and small businesses in need. In our zero waste work at CLF, we're tracking the plastics industry, which is trying to roll back a decade's worth of progress on single-use plastic bans on entirely unnecessary products like single-use plastic bags and polystyrene foam food containers. The plastics industry is pursuing these rollbacks under the auspices of safety, but there's no good evidence out there to show that somehow these single-use plastic products are less of a virus transmission risk than good, clean, reusable products. And it's important not to ignore here the fact that the facilities and the petrochemical manufacturing sites that are making these plastic products have for decades been damaging the respiratory health of the communities that live nearby and putting those communities at greater risk of illnesses like COVID-19. We've also been paying attention to what waste companies are doing throughout the New England region. Many waste companies are trying to push recyclables into landfills so that they can make more money by landfilling more waste at a time of crisis. They, like many other corporate bad actors, are trying to profit at the expense of our environment and the expense of public health when we're in a time of crisis.
That's absolutely true. It's also true that there are good actors out there in the business world, in the corporate world, companies that are moving us toward a more sustainable future, that have made investments in pollution control to protect their local communities. And the real terrible signal that's being sent by many of these rollbacks, many of these essentially discarding of environmental and public health protections, is it's really punishing those good actors, the ones that have made the investment, for example, in better pollution control to control mercury for power plants, knowing that that would happen ultimately. Those companies are now at a disadvantage compared to their competitors because the bad actors are essentially being rewarded for opposing these laws, for violating these laws. And we're seeing that across the board. And even though many companies have recognized the need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, there is Trump pulling us out of the Paris Agreement and rewarding the companies that fought hardest and longest to address the real risks to our climate and to our public health. That's one of the impacts that I think we'll feel for a long time as a result of the Trump administration, and that'll take years to overcome.
Thank you, Brad. We actually have a question now from folks that have joined in. Specifically for you, Brad, can you talk about CLF's logic and attitude for the use of economics versus regulation? Are regulations too static?
Well, regulations have an important purpose in setting standards and protections for communities, in giving companies the guidance they need as to what the requirements are. They don't fit every problem. And so at CLF, we typically use a mix of tools. Regulation is one, enforcing existing law is another, but also using market measures and designing markets so that those good actors that I mentioned and the new and cleaner technologies have a leg up in the marketplace, or they are at least not disadvantaged in the marketplace as they have been for some time. And so that work ranges from the design of the regional electricity markets that are run by our grid operator, so that renewables can compete openly for the sale of electricity at the wholesale level. And it ranges to issues like holding companies accountable for methane leaks. Throughout the region, we have these noisome leaks of methane from the gas distribution system. Methane is one of the most noxious greenhouse gases in its impacts. And yet, not only is there no impetus to stop those leaks, no regulatory safeguard that's been enforced properly, the companies can actually charge us for the methane that they're releasing into the atmosphere that leaks from their system. And so that's one where if we could simply, by regulation, ensure that those companies are fixing those leaks, what you would do is you would have a market impact, and suddenly the cost of natural gas would be the real cost of natural gas, including the need to maintain that system. And renewables would compare favorably and compete favorably in that market. So we don't look at regulation as the do all and end all. It's going to take a series of measures, from regulatory measures to designing markets more fairly, to ensuring that firms are held accountable for the impacts of their action when they directly impact communities. Those are all elements. It's a matrix of efforts, and our mantra has been that we use the law, science, and markets to forge environmental solutions for New England that will lead the world. And that remains the case today, where we not only have experts in regulation, experts in court litigation, but also experts in market and how to steer new investments to healthier options for communities, whether it's in the protection of clean water or the provision of healthier housing for the communities that need it.
And Carol, I think I would just add briefly that there's a reason that the term the law of the land has sort of a special ring to it. There are things that are sort of codified in law or in regulation can take on a special role in terms of messaging and establishing priorities of a state or of a country. And I think that's a important special role that regulations can serve.
Yeah, and I think the issue about regulations being too static is an important one to bear in mind. It does take a long time to produce a new regulation. It's especially tragic when a regulation like the one I mentioned on mercury from power plants, which literally took decades to put into place, is undone with the stroke of a pen during the Trump administration. But there are also important ways in which price signals can help clean our air, and lead us to better, more rational choices. And certainly, foremost among them is the effort to put a price on carbon, so that emitters of carbon are essentially bearing the cost of the product on the environment. And so, in all of the legislatures in which we work, all of the 6 legislatures in New England, we are pushing for laws that would authorize broader use of carbon pricing, so that we can create the infrastructure and create fairer markets where carbon is essentially paying its costs to society, and products that depend on emission of carbon very intensely, like the single-use plastics that Kevin mentioned, are not competing unfairly by essentially dumping their pollution on the public.
Thank you. I'd like to get to a poll. I want to hear from all of you and get a sense of what you think about this question. Do you think there's more public awareness about the need to protect the environment today than there was 50 years ago on the first Earth Day? Yes, no, or do you think it's the same? So if you could just go, if you're on Facebook, you can put your response into the comment section. If you're joining us through the website, use the chat feature and we'll tabulate those results in a little bit. We have another question. You touched on some of this already, but we have another question. Thoughts on very low oil and gas prices, good and bad climate-wise, perhaps perfect timing for an equitable carbon price? I open that up to all of you.
Yeah, it is certainly the case that the bottom falling out on oil prices is a opportunity as well as a threat. The threat being the many efforts, as we've seen over the years, many of them in current law, that are designed to prop up fossil fuels at public expense, to have the public essentially subsidize the extraction of fossil fuels in many different ways, from allowing dumping of waste from drilling and emissions of methane from drilling with no penalty, no safeguards, to very direct subsidies through reduced royalties on oil, gas, and coal pulled from federal land. So we do see an opportunity for carbon pricing to play a role in a more rational price for oil and gas and other fossil fuels. And we hope that there will be a recognition of that. One of the initiatives we're working on, Emily's working on directly, is the Transportation Climate Initiative, which is an effort by northeastern states to address what is becoming in New England, or has become in New England, the biggest source of carbon dioxide emissions and other greenhouse gases, which is the transportation sector. Do you want to say a few words about that, Emily?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Brad. Well, as Brad noted, the transportation sector is now nationwide responsible for the largest share of climate damaging emissions. And here in New England, it's particularly bad. In Massachusetts, it's responsible for more than 40%. In Maine, for instance, it's responsible for more than 50%. So it is absolutely critical that we address these climate changing emissions from transportation. And the Transportation and Climate Initiative is, as Brad has described, one carbon pricing mechanism for doing so. We would like to see that the Transportation and Climate Initiative, that states that join it, that they also do so while carefully crafting rules that allocate the new funding that is generated through the TCI mechanism, the cap and allowance mechanism, to ensure that benefits are equitably distributed. So we want to make sure that folks in New England who currently face a shortage of clean transportation options, particularly rural communities, low-income populations, children, the elderly, minority communities, are the same folks who will reap the benefits under this carbon pricing initiative.
And to that point, we have a question from Katie about how do you envision public transportation initiatives following COVID-19? Do you think the pandemic will pose challenges? And certainly there will be challenges. I would list a few. One is that I think there'll be a slow return to public transportation, slower than we probably would like following the pandemic. and there may be more reluctance, even as gasoline prices are in the basement. There may still be the historical reluctance we've seen to impose any kind of carbon tax in the context of a recession. But there also may be opportunities here. One is that it is likely that, more likely than it was before the epidemic, that Congress will be interested in robust funding for transportation, and we hope while roads and bridges are transporting, that there'll be a significant expenditure on public transit in that. I also think we're seeing in this crisis the reliance we have on the public transportation system, and there are communities that are utterly dependent on transit. There are communities that don't have transit options, and I think there'll be more of a push to make sure all communities have those options, and make sure, and particularly the underserved communities, get the first benefit of any new funding that comes through, whether it's through an infrastructure bill, through a mechanism like the Transportation Climate Initiative, which Emily mentioned. And a final thing that we're seeing is really how where the costs are in much of this. We're seeing, for example, that providing free bus service is not the incredibly expensive burden to the system that people commonly suppose. We're seeing that when we're spending money, we really should be electrifying our commuter rail, because long term, those investments pay for themselves in terms of reduced operating costs and in addition to better service. So I think we're learning through this crisis some of the things that might propel more investments in transit, more just solutions in terms of climate options for different communities, and more attention to the equity for those who really lack the means to get to work, or to get their families to the doctor, or otherwise have a good quality of life.
Before we get to some more questions, I do want to get back to the poll. Can we get the results? Tyler, who's helping us with the back end, the results of the poll. Do you think there's more public awareness about the need to protect the environment? So the results are yes. 33 folks said yes, no, 2, and the same about 6. So it looks like overwhelmingly folks feel that people have more public awareness about the need to protect the environment. So I guess that is a good thing. Before we get to one of the viewer questions, one thing that I just wanted to point out is that the theme of today's Earth Day is climate action, which I think is very fitting, because that's really one of the biggest crises of today's generation. The general consensus that we need to get to zero by 2050. That seems really daunting to a lot of people. Can you speak a bit to how we get there and give us some hope?
Yeah, absolutely, Carol. That is a big question. So I'm going to try to tackle first what I see as kind of the process piece. So first of all, we need to address the climate crisis with a sense of urgency. 2050 might seem like a long way away, but we have no time to lose if we're going to achieve a carbon-free economy by 2050. Decisions that we make today and over the course of the next few years will determine whether or not we are on that trajectory. So we know that to avoid the most devastating impacts of the climate crisis, we need to cut emissions in half by 2030. So how do we do that? We at CLF think that we need to take bold, coordinated action that is explicitly driven by those targets. And that's why we're pushing for binding climate laws in every New England state. As Brad already mentioned earlier, this is something that we've already begun to see. Massachusetts was one of the first states to do such a thing, followed by Connecticut. Most recently in Maine, just last summer, a law was enacted establishing a council for the purpose of cutting emissions while growing the economy, and CLF is participating and pushing for bold climate action there. Meanwhile, in Vermont, the House of Representatives overwhelmingly voted in favor of a similar law in February. And in Rhode Island, the Act on Climate 2020 bill is also gaining traction. While those efforts in the legislatures are largely on hold for the time being, CLF will continue working with allies on these crucial pieces of legislation when they're taken back up. The reason these laws are important is by creating these climate planning and preparation frameworks that have short and long-term milestones, states can slash climate damaging emissions while at the same time growing jobs, creating opportunities in rural and low-income communities, and building resilience. So that's what I think we need to do and how we can do that in terms of the process point. So I'll pause there if anyone has anything to add, and then if you'd like, Carol, we can delve a little bit into the policy as well.
Yeah, I want to. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just going to add to that the climate crisis is also front and center in all of the zero waste work that we're doing at CLF. 99% of the single-use plastics that we're using in this country are derived from fossil fuels. And as we move away from fossil fuels to heat our homes and to power our cars and our vehicles, the industry is pivoting to producing more plastics to make up for some of those low oil prices and for the fact that we're transitioning away from fossil fuels in those ways. And in fact, plastics production and disposal is estimated to eat up about 15% of our remaining carbon budget by the year 2030. So if we're going to tackle our climate crisis, we need to kind of pursue all the available options at our fingertips in terms of wide-reaching climate legislation and also legislation at the state, local, and national level that reduces the plastics in our lives, that cuts down on waste going into landfills, which are the third greatest source of methane in this country, and that moves us away from incinerating our waste. And incinerators have a worse emissions profile than coal-fired power plants. So the more we can do to fix our production and waste systems, the more we can do to ensure a cleaner future and move away from our climate crisis.
Yeah, I'm always struck by the fact that if the plastics industry internationally were a country, it would be the fourth largest emitter of greenhouse gases. But I want to weave together some of the points that Emily was making with a question we have from Toby, which is about whether we should use the low gas prices we currently have to push for a carbon tax. And this also folds in some of the poll results that Carol recited. It is true that there's overwhelming support for environmental protection among the public, including climate action. The challenge has been severalfold. One is that even though people strongly support climate action and strongly support environmental protections and safeguards, it is often the case that their elected officials never hear from them. Or if they hear from them, they don't hear from them about climate and the environment. They'll hear from them about a gas tax. And so one of the most important things is for those who are strongly supporting action on climate, action to improve environmental health and safeguards, is that your elected officials hear from you. A second important point is that the people who have those beliefs need to vote. It is unfortunately the case that the strongest supporters of environmental protection, the strongest supporters of climate action, are often the least likely to go to the polls when they need to. And CLF, on its part, has partnered with the Environmental Voter Project. There's a pledge on our website, which is in an effort to basically prompt, encourage, and cajole people who believe in environmental protection to make sure that they get to the polls. And finally, for those who do raise the issue, it really needs to be clear to your elected officials and to those who represent you at every level of government that this is a priority, that the future matters, that the existential threat that climate presents to our society and the immediate threat that toxics like mercury pose to our health and that of our children that those are priorities that need action and that can't be allowed to fall to the back burner, that can't be allowed to essentially be hidden from view during this crisis as the Trump administration rolls back some of the fundamental safeguards all of us have fought for over the last 30 years.
I'd like for you to dig a little bit deeper into that, Brad, because the theme is climate action, but the first Earth Day was really focused on clean air and water. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the work that still needs to be done there that we can't, the climate is very important, but there's a lot of work that we need to do in terms of keeping our air clean and our water clean.
Well, one of the tragedies of climate change, particular to New England, but really throughout the country, is that climate changes that are already here, and certainly those that are on the horizon, actually make some of those clean air and clean water challenges that the early environmental laws fixed. It makes some of them come back and harder, and makes them harder to address. So, for example, you saw in the intro film the reference to the ExxonMobil facility, which is on a tributary to Boston Harbor, where we have an active lawsuit against ExxonMobil. The fact that intense rains in the Northeast, where you get more than 2 inches over a 24-hour period, throughout the Northeast, those rain events have increased by more than 70%. That's not just a climate problem, it's a pollution problem, because that whole facility was designed for the rains that we had historically going back 20 years. And today, with these more intense rains, the pollution on that site, and every drop of water that falls on the site has to be treated because the site's been in industrial use for a century. The soils are permeated with potent carcinogens, and as well as oil and other toxics. Every drop has to be treated before it is discharged from the facility, every drop of stormwater. What the change in rain patterns has meant is that their treatment system is being overwhelmed on a regular basis, and toxic carcinogens are being discharged into Boston Harbor on a regular basis. Same with clean air. We've made enormous progress in making our air cleaner and healthier over the past 30 years. We don't see those days of intense smog, whether it's in Boston or Los Angeles or New York City anymore. But one dynamic of the warming atmosphere is that even without any new pollution sources, the problem of soot and smog in densely populated areas comes back. And that's not just a clean air problem, not just a climate challenge, it's also a public health challenge, because our success in eliminating soot and smog has been a public health success as well as an environmental success, because soot, smog, or particulates in ground level ozone, those are closely linked to a range of pulmonary and other illnesses, and particularly to epidemic childhood asthma. We can't afford to let those public health victories slip from our fingers, either by ignoring climate or by allowing some of the rollbacks in clean air standards or clean water standards that are now happening.
Kevin, I wonder if you could speak a bit also to a lot of the work that you've been leading through the Zero Waste program in terms of landfills and incinerators.
Yes, absolutely. So landfills and incinerators, in addition to driving a certain percentage of our climate crisis, they are also significant sources of other forms of air pollution and water pollution as well. Landfills can emit hydrogen sulfide and volatile organic compounds into the air, all of which are hazardous for the communities that live nearby these facilities. And on the waterfront, all landfills leak. EPA has said as much. It doesn't matter what you line a landfill with. Eventually, that liner is going to tear or degrade, and the landfill is going to leak and likely contaminate the groundwater upon which nearby families rely for their drinking water. And for the waste that we're not putting in landfills, it means that we're burning that waste in incinerators. And incinerators emit into the air heavy metals like lead and mercury, lung irritants like nitrogen oxides, and compounds like dioxins, which have been described as the most toxic chemicals known to humankind. These air emissions endanger the nearby residents and communities, particularly at times like the crisis we're in now, where people are forced to stay at home. And for those that are forced to live near these incineration facilities, they have no way to escape the dangerous pollution right now. And so the more we can do to use the tools that we have available to us right now to divert waste from landfills and divert waste from incinerators and cut down on single-use plastics, the more we can do to protect the air quality and the water quality for the communities that, again, are forced to live near these facilities.
Yeah, and I think that loops back to the point that Emily was making at the outset about the linkages between what we're seeing in terms of impacts of COVID-19 and what we've historically seen and sadly are still seeing in terms of the impact of pollution. And that is that poor communities, communities of color, are hit first and worst. Whether you're talking about climate risk of flooding or excess of 90 degrees and how lethal they are, or you're looking at dirty air and epidemic childhood asthma. It's really our poorest communities that are the most vulnerable, that are the least protected, and that are last to get the resources they need to protect their own health. And that plays out in all of our work across the board in the same way that COVID-19 is revealing how those inequities play out in our healthcare system. The communities surrounding that Exxon Mobil facility I mentioned, and a similar facility we're suing in Providence, Rhode Island, those are densely populated, poorer, and communities of color. And they are in harm's way because of Exxon Mobil's failure to address climate risks that its own scientists, doing very good science, have recognized really since the Nixon administration, since the first Earth Day. Exxon Mobil scientists have documented the impact of greenhouse gases on our climate and the likely results in terms of catastrophic sea level rise and other climate risks. And yet here we are 50 years later having to sue Exxon Mobil to address the risks that its own scientists raised 50 years ago. So there is an enormous need, not just to ensure that the laws are enforced to protect every community, but also that our various environmental rules are crafted in a way that recognizes the disproportionate burden that our poorest communities and also communities of color have borne. And, looping back to Kevin, it is in fact the case that that's where landfills are typically sited. That's where facilities like the Exxon Mobil and Shell facilities that we're suing are typically sited, in the heart of densely populated communities that are put at risk and that typically don't have the resources or the power to call those companies to account unless they are able to get groups like CLF to partner with them and hold those companies to account.
And similarly, Brad, I'll just add that it is the same communities that are also disproportionately exposed to air pollution from transportation. So from the trucks that are coming and going from the sort of facilities that Kevin is talking about, from highways, from downtown traffic. And so these issues of health and of pushing for equitable solutions for communities that have been historically overburdened is also particularly salient in our transportation work as well. It really permeates all of our work.
I just want to remind people that questions for, oh, sorry, go ahead, Brad.
Yeah, we have a question from Carl about what can we do to advance offshore wind right now. And I think there are a number of things that we can do collectively and individually. First is to make sure your legislators know that you support clean energy, that you support offshore wind as a way to uh, wean New England off of fossil fuels like fracked gas and the few coal plants remaining. Second, uh, we need, wherever possible, to make sure the markets are fair so that wind energy can compete. And third, we need, in some cases, the federal government to get out of the way. The Trump administration recently threw a wrench in the works in the permitting of the first major, what would be the second offshore wind farm in New England, but really the first one of enormous scale. And so we need both the regulators that Trump has instructed to slow down uh, offshore wind to follow the law. We also need some of our strong climate advocates, including a number of elected officials, to be leaders in this effort. You can't be a climate leader and then, essentially raise concerns about every, potential issue that comes up, as we've seen some of our elected officials do in the context of limitations on fishing that would result, commercial fishing that would result as a result of developing some of the wind farms. So we need action on all of those fronts, in addition to where you can, and in most cases you can, individual consumers trying to, where to buy offshore wind energy for themselves, as we've done, for example, at CLF's facilities in Boston, where we're now a fossil fuel-free facility. And so those are all elements that we need to do to push offshore wind along. It's one of the reasons we're fighting in the market day in and day out to make sure the rules for purchasing and selling electricity at the wholesale level are fair to wind, because we're now seeing an enormous change in which new onshore and offshore wind is now competitive in many markets with coal-fired generation, including coal-fired generation from coal plants that are already built. We're seeing that renewables can and will complete and can and will displace our reliance on fossil fuels if the rules are fair. Just in the last decade, we've seen the price of solar energy, for example, come down by more than 2/3, and it's still coming down. We've seen the costs of storage, electricity energy storage, come down comparably. And of course, we need storage to complement solar and wind because of their intermittent nature. So we see time and again that the technologies we need to move to a cleaner fossil-free future are there. They're on the shelf, and in many cases, they're already competitive if we have the political will to move forward with the policies we need to support clean energy, clean wind, and solar.
Thank you, Brad. And we're running in. We're about 10 minutes away from the hour, and just want to squeeze in one more poll, if you don't mind. And I think this is an issue that we think a lot about, because when we first started talking about being environmentalists, we were so proud of ourselves when we started recycling. But the question is, do you have any idea of what you were supposed to recycle? Do you understand what you should recycle and what is not recyclable? Yes or no? Very simple poll. So if you could just get your answers in there on Facebook, you just put in the comment section. And if you're joining us on the website, through the chat, please let us know what your thoughts are on that. And I asked that question because it's been really dominating the news of late before the COVID-19, is that we really have a recycling crisis. And I thought, Kevin, I'd really like you to speak on that a bit. What happened and what's going on?
Yeah, absolutely. Our curbside single stream recycling systems throughout New England and throughout the country are really broken. Costs have spiraled out of control. There are some communities that are paying more for their recycling right now than they're paying to dispose of their municipal solid waste, which really doesn't make sense and sets up a really bad set of incentives. And the other big problem is that much of what we're putting in the recycling bin isn't actually recycled at the end of the day. And I'll use as an example single-use plastic bottles, like our soda bottles and our water bottles. Only about 6% of those bottles are recycled into new bottles every year in the US. That is failure. That's not meaningful recycling if we're only turning about 6% of those into new bottles. And the problem here isn't our fault, the consumers. It's not about we're not putting the right things in the bin. The problem is that we have companies out there that are pumping out all of this unrecyclable plastic junk that can't be meaningfully recycled. And so we're pushing at CLF for new laws and new policies to hold these producers accountable. And one of the big policies that we're pushing for is called producer responsibility. And we have a quick little explainer video here just to run through what producer responsibility is and how it might help us.
Recycling is supposed to help keep our environment clean, right? Well, here's the bad news. Our recycling system is broken. What you can and can't recycle is, frankly, really complicated. And sorting through all of it takes time and money. Plus, a lot of what you put in your recycling bin actually ends up in a landfill or incinerator, and that's not good. We didn't create this mess. Big corporations did. They keep churning out a flood of single-use packaging that's drowning our environment. And the bill to manage their waste? That's paid by our cities and towns. It's time for producers to own their mess. And we can make it happen with a law called producer responsibility. The idea is simple. Companies that make and use single-use packaging reimburse towns and cities for the cost of managing their recycling. This motivates producers to make smarter choices and spares towns and cities from footing the bill. Producer responsibility laws save us money and keep our environment clean. Learn more about producer responsibility at clf.org/responsible.
So by shifting these costs back onto producers and by passing laws like single-use plastic bans and pursuing better recycling systems like bottle bills, we can start to shift the tide here and keep waste out of incinerators, out of landfills, and move towards reusable solutions to protect those communities, particularly that Brad was speaking about, that have no choice but to live near landfills and live near incinerators.
And we actually have a question just following up on what you're discussing right now, Kevin, is how do you recommend New Hampshire work with the governor and others to reverse the ban on reusable bags post-COVID?
So one of the most effective ways of pushing single-use plastic bans that we've seen throughout New England is working with local communities. Particularly here in Rhode Island, it's community action on passing single-use plastic bans at a local level that really has driven an emphasis to the state on passing a statewide ban. We saw the same thing in Connecticut, and we're seeing it in Massachusetts as well. So I would encourage anyone who's interested in this to work with their local community on the local level to build support for things like plastic bag bans.
And we're getting pretty close here. I just want to let folks know that we're actually going to be delving a little bit more into this topic. Many of you have reached out to us and said you want to talk a little bit more about the Zero Waste program. And so can we bring up, we actually have quite a few things coming up to keep you engaged, such as this, the President Speaker Series. And do we have a slide with some of the upcoming events that we have? And I encourage you to go to our website and find out how you can sign up so you can just stay engaged and we can have more conversations such as this. I don't know if we have that up or not. I can't see it, but anyway, at this is the screen. I'm not sure if it's up, but anyway, Brad, if you can just kind of wrap us up with some last thoughts?
Well, on this 50th Earth Day, we've spent a lot of this past hour, identifying some of the major threats we have, identifying some of the areas where more sad areas where progress we've made reversed. But I think it's also important to recognize that there are so many areas where CLF advocacy and citizen advocacy are making a difference and creating points of hope, even as we face these very daunting headwinds in terms of climate peril and in terms of public health threats. Even as Trump withdrew and is continuing to withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement, we here in New England, we've had a number of governors say we're still in. In fact, every governor save one in New England has said they are still in, and the states and municipalities that are still committed to reducing climate pollution in accordance with the Paris Climate Agreement now encompass more than 2/3 of the U.S. economy. Our governor in Massachusetts, Charlie Baker, under the law that CLF helped enact and went to the highest court in the state to enforce, has said we need to move the goalposts on climate action, not to 80% by 2050, which is the goal under the current statute, but we need to make it net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, which ought to be the standard, and it's the standard we're pursuing across states. Even as some laws are under-enforced, and CLF is in court on many fronts to hold polluters accountable under the Clean Water Act, for instance, we are seeing areas where the science is prevailing and where states are moving to greater protection, and where courts are intervening when polluters aren't complying with the law and the Trump administration is not enforcing the law. When it comes to some of our most iconic New England resources, like the North Atlantic right whale, one of the most endangered species on the planet, down to about 400 individual, where we're losing too many of the newborn right whales to entanglements in fishing gear and ship strikes and other perils. Just in the last 10 days, in response to a CLF lawsuit that Emily Green helped litigate, a federal court intervened and said no to the Trump administration, no to their violation of the law, and in fact declared that the administration's failure to better protect the North Atlantic right whale, to comply with the Endangered Species Act when taking action, that it was about as straightforward a violation of the Endangered Species Act as you could come up with, to paraphrase the court. Those types of victories and confidence not only in the rule of law, but in the wisdom of communities and the leadership in the private sector to put solutions in place, whether it's on climate or clean water or clean air. Those are points of hope on this 50th Earth Day. As we look forward, there is every reason to think that with your support, with your advocacy, with your activism, CLF will continue to make progress in New England that will help propel progress throughout the U.S. and throughout the country. We can't do it alone. We need your support, both in terms of your activism and in terms of your support for us as an organization. But with your support, and we're grateful to those of you on the line today who have been our stalwart supporters, we can make real progress. We are making real progress, and we continue to do so even as we work from our homes and maintain the social distancing we need to see ourselves safely through this crisis. So thank you for all that you do, all the support and activism you provide, and as we face these very trying days, very anxious days in which public health is at issue, we are ever more grateful for the fact that this work remains your concern, your priority. More grateful for the fact that we have supporters like you to help move this work forward. So that's what we're celebrating this Earth Day. We're celebrating the partnership we have with you and our partnership with so many other organizations who are our allies as we take on some incredibly daunting challenges that we need to take on if we're to protect our own health and if we're to provide a livable climate to the children and grandchildren that follow us. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Brad. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Kevin. And thank you, everyone who joined us today. By the way, you were about split on the recycling poll. Sorry we didn't get to that. But thank you and stay in touch. Happy Earth Day.